Okay, I'm going to try and finish the C's here because, again, there's some other names that we're not going to get to yet, and there are other terms, but again, I'm skipping some of those because because some of them I just don't think are going to be on the tests or are going to be part of um, classes that might come up, or won't be something that maybe I would use in group. So I am skipping some stuff, so we're going to try and finish the C's here as well. So we have conservation and symmetry, principles of. Fundamental principles of physics, principles of conservation, state and quantities, for example, matter and energy, that remain constant in all physical and chemical processes. Matter and energy can be neither created nor destroyed, though their form may change. Super important to know that. Principles of symmetry state which changes we can make in a physical system without changing its structure. So they're going to talk about this a little bit more. The conservation of matter is an ancient philosophical principle holding that there can be no creation ex nihilo, something that cannot be created from nothing. The principle of conservation of energy in its modern form is summarized by the first law of thermodynamics, which states that the total amount of energy in a closed system remains constant. For example, the heat energy released by burning a cubic foot of natural gas equals the loss of stored chemical energy in the gas. So, if you're gonna burn, X amount of a thing, and that can only give you, Y amount of energy, that's all you're going to get out of it. You're not going to get less, you're not going to get more, but there are things that can change that sort of availability. But this is just sort of general state of that. The principle of conservation of momentum, the product of mass and its velocity, states that the total momentum of an isolated physical system stays constant even though the momentum of its parts may change. When a flying artillery shell explodes, the total momentum of its fragments equals the momentum of the shell before the explosion. So it's conserving. It has the same sort of energy behind it, even though the thing transferring the energy has changed. But then again, this isn't taking into account certain things that what's the thing with the momentum is, I'm blanking on the popular way to say it right now. I just had it a second ago. That objects in motion will stay in motion unless acted upon by a different force. So in a system without any friction, like in space, I throw a baseball in space, whatever force I put into that baseball is going to continue with that same force unless something else acts on it. For example, to a certain extent, we don't buy gasoline for our automobiles because we're getting it to go. We're buying gasoline for our automobiles to be able to fuel its having to manage with friction because of gravity, because of air friction and everything like that. When we pump the gas on a car to go 30 miles an hour or whatever like that, all those other things create a loss of momentum. So we need fuel to be able to keep that momentum steady. Where was I? Einstein's special theory of relativity, which was first, and then in general came later. Right? I think so. Which united space and time into space-time, also united mass and energy into the famous formula E equals mc squared, which demonstrated that mass can be converted into energy. The classical laws of conservation of matter, momentum, and energy were thus unified in the conservation of mass energy. So that's where we get like nuclear power. You have matter, which would be the atom, can get transferred into energy. There's a huge release of that energy when you transfer it, though, and that's where we get the nuclear stuff from. My cat does this weird honking snore. It's actually kind of funny. Principles of symmetry govern situations in which systems or objects can be moved or manipulated without altering their structure. For instance, a sphere is said to be highly symmetrical because it remains a sphere when it is rotated. Physical laws also have symmetry. The laws of mechanics and electromagnetism have reflection, or right-hand, left-hand symmetry. A propeller screw turning clockwise will obey the same mechanical laws as its mirror image opposite turning counterclockwise. So, I mean, you're going to get thrust. If you're, got a boat in the water, it's going to get thrust. It might take you backwards or forwards, but you're still going to get movement. In 1918, the German mathematician Emmy Noether demonstrated a remarkable connection between conservation and symmetry. For every symmetry, there is a conserved quantity. That cat's cracking me up. Systems that have rotational symmetry conserve angular momentum. Systems that have are symmetrical in space, that do not change when the entire system is moved, conserve linear momentum. Oh, that was a semicolon. There we go. Systems that are symmetrical in time, that do not depend on when they are observed, conserve energy. Systems that have reflection symmetry are said to conserve parity. Much of modern physics has involved the search for additional symmetries, partly because physicists are charmed by the aesthetics of the concept, but also because to understand change is essential to know what does not change. Sometimes even why. In quantum mechanics, symmetry principles state which changes in atoms are allowed or forbidden, accounting for the wavelengths and intensities of radiation emitted and absorbed, and enabling scientists to suggest new particles that might or should exist. So because of all those changes, whether if it's moving in a way that it should, we can be like, okay, go. If it's moving then it's a way that it shouldn't, there might be something else in there that we have yet to be able to understand or find. All these developments support scientists' conviction that symmetry, with its correlate, conservation, is a basic characteristic of the natural world. So let me skip those. I'm going to go to creationism. The belief that the universe was created by God exactly as recounted in the biblical book of Genesis. Also, the doctrine that the theory of evolution does not satisfactorily account for the existence of life on Earth, and that the evidence for a suddenly created and fixed, rather than an evolved and changing universe, is more compelling. Most religious creationists are fundamentalist Christians who believe that the Bible is the literal Word of God, that the world was created in 6 days, and that it is no more than 8,000 years old. Scientific creationism seeks to make the case for a suddenly created universe by refuting the scientific evidence for evolution and offering alternative explanations of scientific data. Its adherents, a small minority of the scientific community, maintain that life could not have sprung from non-living matter, that the multiplicity, complexity, and diversity of species could not have been developed from single-celled organisms through mutation and natural selection as required by the theory of evolution, even though we're talking about billions of years involved, that the Earth's geological features have been formed by catastrophic changes rather than millennial processes. See catastrophism and uniformitism. And that scientists' predisposition to the evolutionary explanation biases their interpretation of biological, geological, and archaeological data. Many other scientists, while rejecting the biblical version of creation, nevertheless believe that the intricacy and variety of the cosmos imply design, and therefore a designer. The one thing I will note about this is that, sort of regular sort of scientists, the way they do it, will discount out of hand a certain amount of catastrophe. There are things in archaeological and geological data which really do point to, holy crap, this was a really bad couple days with this, but they'll throw it out. And part of the reason for that is because they were trying to completely get out of anything, like we said in the previous video, anything that had anything to do with what might look like anything biblical or anything spiritual, religious, occult, mystical, anything. It's completely thrown out. But that does bias the way they're looking at some things. So they'll ignore that all these other stories from all over the world, with people who allegedly had no contact, all have a flood myth. They all have a flood myth that seemed to happen at a certain time, and those certain times actually corresponds to geological data. Now, when that geological data was initially brought up, they're like, no, it couldn't be that. That all this stuff that happened, it looked like we were coming out of one ice age, something bad happened, and the glaciers moved really fast for glaciers. Now, glaciers should move super slow, like barely moving like inches over many, 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 many years. This stuff was moving like over a huge portion of land in a couple of weeks, which would just grind up and destroy all this stuff. There's a ton of stuff in the Pacific Northwest and the northern United States that shows like this stuff was just moving fast, and things that huge things are going from here to over there and shouldn't have happened. And then 1200 years later, stuff's moving super fast again. So because this could look like something biblical, like the biblical flood deluge, nope, didn't happen. All this stuff was because, this very slow evolutionary progressive things. But that doesn't work like that. We don't even grow like that. I mean, I was talking to my parents about this this summer. I still have the stretch marks to show it. I grew like 3 inches in one summer. Now my progress is a little bit slow, and then you get a growth spurt, slow and a growth spurt, and that happens within, the world as well. There was, it took forever for people to be like, well, we have the evidence to show that, hey, this thing happened 65 million years ago. It corresponds with where the sort of line of data that we're getting from the dinosaurs dying off apparently seems to happen, that there was some sort of impact from something not of Earth. If we say extraterrestrial, I don't mean aliens and that sort of thing. Extraterrestrial is something outside of Earth, terrestrial, terra being Earth. No, that didn't happen. It was this, that, and the other thing. And no, we're finding out, no. Big meteor impact changed, it was a worldwide change in climate and things like that, started wiping stuff out. So while if left alone, there could be a certain gradualism, data is showing that there are spikes in something happening that could either be, hey, this was really happy and beneficial, or this really messed us all up. So there is a little bit of that with things too to look at and think of. Okay, critical theory. I will do I think there's only 2 or 3 more, so I'm going to try and get this through this relatively quickly. Radical, multidisciplinary, neo-Marxist school of social and cultural criticism that emphasizes social transformation as well as critical analysis. I don't know why I got commercial there for a second, sorry. More broadly, the term refers to a school of thought that challenges conventional beliefs and social arrangements. Critical theory is historically associated with the Institute for Social Research, founded in Frankfurt, Germany in 1923 and known as the Frankfurt School. The approach is eclectic, meaning a lot of stuff, drawing on a variety of intellectual traditions and seeking a synthesis of sociology, psychology, philosophy, and political theory. Max Horkheimer was the Institute's director from 1930 to 1958 and contributed strongly to the formulation of its basic themes. The most important thinkers associated with the Frankfurt School in the years before World War II were Theodor Adorno, Walter Benjamin, Erich Fromm, and Herbert Marcuse. In the second generation of critical theorists that arose in the 1960s, the most prominent was Jürgen Habermas. Most of the school's members fled Germany after the rise of the Nazis. Benjamin committed suicide rather than be captured by the Gestapo, and the institute was relocated in New York until 1950. The Frankfurt School promoted cooperative research but did not produce a unitary social theory. However, its members shared a general outlook and dialectical approach and articulated similar themes. These included a critique of modern capitalism that also rejected Soviet communism and questioned many of the assumptions of orthodox Marxism, including the crucial role of a revolutionary proletariat, an examination of the social and psychological basis of modern authoritarianism and racism, an aesthetic critique that probed the socially conditioned nature of form and meaning, a reprisal of the Enlightenment idea of reason in light of the alienation produced by technological industrial society, and a repudiation of modern social sciences positivism. It's a lot. While challenging the scientism and determinism of traditional Marxist thought, critical theorists have also explored the parallels between capitalist democracies and societies under state socialism, finding both governed by comparable organizational, technological, and ideological systems of domination. In the capitalist West, the proletariat, far from being a revolutionary force, has been manipulated and co-opted, pacified with material goods and mass culture. Critical theory questions social scientists' faith in empiricism, holding that neutral social analysis is an illusion. Everyone's kind of got their own thing that they're trying to work for. A so-called objectivity serves to perpetuate the status quo. Especially nowadays, definitely something to think about. The point, as Marx had said, is not merely to interpret the world, but to change it. Further, any valid social science, including critical theory itself, must be critical not only of the assumptions underpinning social structures, but of its own methodological and ideological biases. Sure, cool, sounds good to me. Not only it's like, hey, look, this stuff's messed up, but I have to pay attention to how I'm doing this too. We're going to skip the people here with this. I'm going to skip Cubism. Just know that there was a early 20th century movement, visual arts, challenging three-dimensional objects. Picasso, a bunch of other, and Basque, and we're big with that. It's something to know that exists. If you want to look it up more, Cubism exists. Look it up. Cultural materialism, on the other hand, is the view that the nature of society's culture is determined by its material, particularly economic, conditions. The idea derives from the Marxist analysis of social systems, but is not held exclusively by Marxists. The term was coined independently in the 1960s and 70s by anthropologist Marvin Harris and literary critic Raymond Williams in relation to the respective fields. See Harris's The Rise of the Anthropological Theory of 1968 and Cannibals and Kings, The Origins of Cultures 1978, Williams' Marxism and Literature in 1977, and Problems in Materialism and Culture in 1980. Both approaches emphasize the role of material environmental circumstances in shaping cultural expressions and the necessity of taking into account the historical context in which those expressions arose in order to fully understand them. A little bit of epigenetics there, that the epigenetics can influence kind of what's going on, but also you need to know, the context in which a thing arose from. Okay. For example, Harris argued that in human societies, the means of production, whether hunting and gathering or industrial manufacturing, determine the nature of economic structures, which in turn determine social relations and individuals' worldviews, which shape artistic and other cultural expressions. In literary criticism, cultural materialists tend to see texts as either advancing or subverting the dominant ideology rather than reflecting universal truths. Oh, yeah, so it could just be, I'm reading this book now, and it's, is this book that I'm reading, like the book I'm reading now, uh, samurai, the guy talking about being a samurai, almost like a philosophical thing from like the 1700s. That would be seen as advancing the dominant ideology of the time, especially since it was really talking about in terms of retainers and service and giving up your life for your the person you're serving is sort of like the highest good sort of thing. So that would definitely be advancing the dominant ideology. And then again, but if you read like 1984 or um, wow, why can't I think of that? Aldous Huxley's book. Um, Brave New World. Wow, I should not have taken that long to think of that. Those would definitely be things, or even Clockwork Orange and stuff like that, would be subverting the dominant ideological ideas, and that those works aren't creating anything that's kind of higher than that. They're just sort of products of it. Cybernetics. Cybernetics is the study of communication and control mechanisms in complex biological, electromechanical, and social systems, a multidisciplinary field closely related to systems theory and information theory. What are you going to do about it, cat? There's a dog barking downstairs. You're not going to do anything. The science was founded and the term introduced from the Greek for steersman by the American mathematician Norbert Wiener in the late 1940s. In his view, all self-regulating systems, from mechanical servo mechanisms to electronic computers to the human brain and nervous system, govern themselves according to the same principles. Wiener observed that all such systems operate via a recurrent feedback loop, detecting external influences and internal changes, making adjustments, and monitoring the results. So whatever's happening in the outside world, double checking what's happening in with us. We change or make adjustments or change our behavior or thoughts in compliance with what situations we have, either externally or internally, and then we see if that works. To function effectively, therefore, yeah, I was right, all such systems must have effective communication among their constituent subsystems and efficient control mechanisms to regulate their operations. For example, the act of reaching for an apple involves an interactive sensory motor cycle in which the information supplied to the eye about what the hand is doing is fed back to the brain, to the nerves and the muscles controlling the hand, whose movement gives more information to the eye, and so forth in a cycle that continues until the task is completed. Wiener's cybernetic theory grew out of his work during World War II on anti-aircraft tracking devices, which had to make continuous adjustments to the gun's trajectories to hit their moving targets. Excuse me. Cybernetics now embraces wildly varied fields of endeavor, including communication theory, industrial automation, institutional management, statistics, probability theory, artificial intelligence, neurophysiology, cognitive psychology, and gestalt psychology. The sociological theory of cybernetic hierarchies proposed by Talcott Parsons, there's a name, suggests that all complex systems from individual organisms to society as a whole operate through self-regulating, intercommunicating mechanisms. So not necessarily when we're talking about cybernetic, we're not necessarily talking about, cyborgs and robots and terminators or anything. It's the the input of sort of information, the double checking internally, and then reacting. In other words, like that loop would be what would be considered cybernetic in this context. Last one in C's, cynicism. Cynicism. Greek philosophical movement founded in the 4th century BCE or BC, so before Christ. If you're going with the BC 80, BCE means before Common Era. Same time frame. They just added the other thing to kind of take the religious implication out of it. Probably by Diogenes of Sinope, and influential in the 5th century through the 5th century CE. So it would be AD. So 400s. The Cynics took their name either from their Athenian meeting place, called the Synosarges, or from the word kynikos, dog-like, referring to the free, unfettered lifestyle that gave them the nickname dog philosophers. That sounds pretty good, actually. Cynicism was informed by contempt for the established political and social norms and characterized by a rigorous asceticism. So if we remember back from before, because this one was a little hard, we had aesthetics, AE, versus aesthetics, which is the ASC, which we talked about. The principle of self-denial for the purpose of attaining a higher heightened state of spiritual awareness, intellectual acuity, or physical ability. So as opposed to the talking and thinking and looking at art and beauty, this was a certain amount of denial about things in order to kind of raise up yourself as a human being. The Cynics made a sharp distinction between natural and artificial values, exalting virtue as the highest good and rejecting material possessions and social as well as religious conventions as tyrannies that caged the spirit. It is said that Diogenes slept in a tub, and that once, when he saw a slave drinking from a cupped hand, he broke his only bowl. The Cynics scorned formal philosophy, refusing to debate their position and mocking, in words and actions, that had to be interesting, all intellectual and material pretensions. Their disdain for worldly power is illustrated in the story of Diogenes' meeting with Alexander the Great. When Alexander asked the sage if there was some service he could do him, Diogenes replied, "Stand a little less between me and the sun." So this is a guy who had conquered and just leading an army and all this other stuff, and the guy was just like, "Yeah, get out of my sun." Today's meaning of the word cynic, someone who assumes the worst about human nature, no doubt derives from the cynic's contempt for conventional values. So there is a distinction between that. If we're talking about, sort of cynics, big C, the philosophers, we're talking about what we just talked about, the sort of little c, oh, you're such a cynic, or something like that. They're talking about all this stuff kind of sucks. And it's because people suck. This was reflected in the caustic writings of Diogenes' pupil Crates, who later those of Menippus, considered the originator of prose satire. So prose, almost like reading a novel sort of thing instead of verse, which they had a lot of the sort of stuff with that, the plays of Sophocles. If you read a more sort of direct translation of the Iliad and the Odyssey, those are all in verse. Prose would be, like if you read a novel. The classic image of Diogenes walking the streets with a lighted lantern in broad daylight searching for a, quote, honest man is thoroughly cynical. In their lives of virtuous poverty, the Cynics paralleled the spiritual asceticism of Buddhism and Hinduism and prefigured Christian monasticism. I am having a hell of a time today. Monasticism. Dyslexia is really high. I'm flat out not even seeing letters at the moment. Cynicism has also been called the first Western, quote, back to nature movement, rejecting the ostentation and hypocrisy of society for a simpler, purer life, an impulse that was reportedly arisen in all historical epochs down to the hippies of the 1960s. So there we have it, ladies and gentlemen, and everything and everyone else. The end of the seas.